Welcome to CIC. This is number 19. Recently, I went to the Tàpies Foundation in Barcelona, and I'd like to show you a little bit of what I saw there. Now, the foundation is meant for Tàpies, set up by him, and it also showcases other artists that were not fortunate to have the same limelight as his. More on that later, another in the future CIC. This exhibition, called The Perpetual Movement of the Wall, is an interesting one in that it tracks his development as an artist in the decade between 1950 and 1960. Now, a little bit about Tàpies. I'm hard-pressed to come up with a city so identified with a singular artist, as Barcelona is with the work of Antoni Tàpies. Certainly, there are three artists that are graced with museums in the city, or at least a museum and a foundation. One would be the Miró Museum, Museu Miró in Montjuïc. And certainly Miró is Catalan, profoundly so. But in a way, Miró is more international when, at least for artists like me, when we think of Miró, we're not thinking specifically of Catalonia, although perhaps we should be. Miró seems to be more international than not. And Picasso left. He left Barcelona for Paris, famously. But his roots were established here. He grew up here. He became who he was here in Barcelona. So the Barcelona Museum is a great place to see the early works of Picasso. Just as a parenthetical, it's summer heat here in Tossa de Mar, and it is bloody hot. The camera stopped working when I was filming upstairs. Welcome to CIC number 19. And so this is the second location I set up to shoot out of many takes. So if you see me doing this, it's because I'm sweating. So, of Tàpies, and how do you describe his work? Well, most artists know him, but in a way artists don't. They think of him as an art informal artist, which is the European corollary to abstract expressionism, although they're quite different probably when you get into the weeds. And rude, broad strokes categories, they map onto each other in a certain way. But Tàpies is outside of that, and the works are not some guttural expression of emotions or the identity of an artist in that way. That Tàpies reaches out, not only expressing himself as a Catalan, but then reaches out to levels of symbolism and representation that go back to the caves of Altamira and the streets of Barcelona, which parenthetically, Tàpies is Catalan for wall as well. So in a way, you can call him Tony Wall, as would be the rough colloquialization of his name. And the walls of Barcelona bear a great resemblance to his work. It's interesting to compare the expression of just everyday walls with the graffiti and the history. Oftentimes you'll see bullet holes from the Spanish Civil War where there were executions. It's interesting to compare the two, but in a way an oversimplification, because Tàpies himself would want himself to be much more universal. A lot of times in interviews with him, and there are a ton of things online that you can find, interviews with the artist, often overly melodramatic and too much production value is too syrupy for me, but he's reaching out to Oriental influences, Asiatic, Buddhistic, Hinduistic. He wants to be this sort of, in a way, a universal artist. But where he's coming from to be universal is certainly Catalan, and he's profoundly Catalan. His father, he's so Catalan, his father was the co-founder of the political party called ERC, Esquerra Republicana Català, he was also, Tàpies was also one of the co-founders of the art movement called Dau al Set, which I think in Catalan means the seventh dice, or seventh throw of the dice, or something like that, where it was a movement that was, I've read, has been described as a fusion of surrealist and Dadaist kind of influences. But it was the early manifestations, post-war manifestations of an identity of art movements within Catalonia and within Spain. So, to the building. It is quite an interesting building in the fabric of Barcelona. The Museu Tàpies is housed in Barcelona's famed high-end art publishing house by the name of Montaner i Simón, which was established in 1861 as a publishing house, and whose various branches in Barcelona were consolidated in a singular building, built in 1880 by Lluís Domènech i Montaner. And a rude and yet useful oversimplification would pair Domènech i Montaner and Antoni Gaudí as two poles architecturally of Barcelona's Art Nouveau. Montaner being the eclectic rationalist of Art Nouveau in Barcelona, and Gaudí being the expressionist variety. The building itself was innovative in its time in that it used the material architectonically as you would see in markets and railway stations at that time, meaning exposed brick, iron, and glass. Atop the building, filling the space between the adjoining neighboring facades, is a Tàpies sculpture entitled Cloud and Chair. Now let's take a walk through the exhibition and check out the show. And the first thing I do when I walk in is I look at that library, and what I'm going to do right now is just zoom right in there and check it out and show you guys. You can see the barrel vaults between the stacks, the window, not stained glass, but close to it at the far end, in the oculus. And these stacks were as literally the warehouse for the publishing house Montaner i Simón. You can imagine this is the warehouse of the late 1800s in its language. And now as a library for the Fundació Tàpies. And this is one place that I would love to get in. And I'll try to do it someday probably. And just spend some time along the stacks looking at these books. And no doubt it has historical documents from Tàpies himself. And I'm wondering how many of these books are in Tàpies' collection, books that he actually read himself. I would assume so. And this place is just such a gorgeous library. I'm just taking my time, taking a look at it. Just soaking it in. But let's take a look at the show itself. And the first thing you see is the poster for the show. Tàpies painted in various mixed media the advertising for the show itself, which makes me want to give a shout out to my old friend, artist Bart Exposito, who I know has done a number of these kinds of advertisings, taking this opportunity graphically to impart his touch as an artist to his exhibitions, and this is what Tàpies did. And so in the first part of the show, and what you're seeing are various artworks incidental to the show, but each of the 4 shows on offer are the effort has been made by the curator to restage it as close to the original exhibitions as possible. And so this one on the white wall, it just contains ephemera, which I think I'll be scanning here pretty soon. But the biggest thrust of this show, which was staged in 1950 at the Galeria Laetanas in Barcelona, here you can see how Tàpies was well rooted in the exemplars that influenced him so much in his trajectory as an artist. And here we're talking about Miro. We're probably talking about Paul Klee. I'd like to sort of invoke Fontana later on, but I'm not sure how close it is since they were contemporaneous, and I'm not sure how much was seen by each artist. But certainly Miro is really strong. Klee, very strong. And Dali, no doubt. If you look into the renderings of this painting and the smoothing of values and colors and the atmosphere, definitely surrealist, and this would be the Time of Dao set, and that surrealist Dada thing, this being more surrealist than Dada. And here's what I think is the touch of Dali. And this background, so carefully treated, but still derivative, not mature yet, but considered formidable in his time. And since the art world in those days was so small, and it's gotten so large now, and parenthetically, I think that there's still the same number, and not proportionally, of great artists, but the population is so much larger nowadays. But in those days, it was, I assume, quite easy that Tàpies, in his social set, because his family was upper middle class or upper class, that he would have access to artists like Miro and was able to walk into his studio and become close friends with him. But here, as a young artist, he's what do you call it? Throwing your oats, seeding your oats. He's experimenting. He's looking for his influences. Here's this graffito that you'd see in Klee. And here we see an arm, which later on becomes, body parts become one of his languages. And the way that he rendered this arm makes me think of the famous loaf of bread painted by Dali. Maybe not as good as Dali, but who cares? It's an effort. But these atmospherics, this sort of deliberate, surrealist perspectives, this cosmic celestial thing, which I think that later on in his career is one of his enduring kinds of motifs that he reaches out to. And these chessboards and pinwheels and strange, a bit of Chagall maybe. And here, Tàpies' self-portrait as a goth, a proto-goth. Looks like Nosferatu maybe, or something like that. Now, I'm backtracking a little bit, not going in a kind of clockwise or counterclockwise, whatever, motion around the gallery. I'm backtracking because this is the second show that he, that is spotlit in this exhibition. Again, at the Gallery Leitanes, 4 years later, in 1954, in Barcelona. And coincident with this show was another show called Grupo R, and that show had such success that they extended it, so Tàpies, in a way, shared the gallery with the overlapping shows in this exhibition. But they included in this show, in an effort to become as close to the original installation as possible, the Klee influence is so strong here. And maybe influences to South America, which I don't command knowledge of the art thing, but this makes me think there's got to be throwbacks to influences from South American artists, modern artists. And the ephemera from the show. showing there was also an art fair associated with this, and Corbusier was involved in the art fair. A kind of industrial in the fair, a kind of industrial and sort of modern exhibition. But note the hanging, these sort of hanging strategies for this. This is the way the paintings were exhibited, with high raking light and white walls, and this wire, very peculiar to my eyes as a Yankee. Very eccentric, but very interesting to me. And again, the work in these 4 years hasn't traveled very far from what we've seen in 1950. There's maybe an enlargement of it, especially this painting. The curious thing about seeing the work in person versus what I'm recording here in camera is that it's much more vivid on camera. Standing before the work, it dulls out a bit, and these distinctions, these tonalities, these colors don't pop as they do on camera, which is, I don't know what to think about that. But for 1954, there's a kind of reveling in this sort of ersatz modernism, in a way, a kind of popularized idea of what modernity meant in those early post-war years. And again, a kind of cubist influence, and it pales in comparison to Picasso, got to say. But one of the things I like to, whenever I meet a young artist and who's anxious about discovering their own language, is I usually say that the way that you find out who you really are is to copy someone you love. Copy them as closely as you can, and then notice very closely the ways in which you part from that influence, the anomalies, the awkwardness, the handling that's is just not as suave as the exemplar that you're looking at. And in those awkward moments, you'll find yourself, and all you have to do is amplify that. And I think after this show, this is what happened to Tàpies. My theory, okay? There must have been the same kind of dissatisfaction, and you don't want to live in the shadow of and in comparison to another great artist, which I think Miro at this time was already super well established, the king of his medium. And with this painting, the last of that. And they have, for reasons that I haven't been able to understand, check this out, that's Franco touring this art fair. And I think Tàpies was part of that. I didn't stick around for the entire screening, but this is on a loop. And in a way, it's showing, in a way, his antagonist, Generalissimo Dictator Franco. And in this exhibition, I assume his work was included, and somehow a distinction was made. And again, this is a very wide-ranging art fair, showing the tendencies of what was considered breaking art at that time. An art fair. It's a biennial, I think maybe in Argentina. So this would be the exhibition at Galerie Stadler in Paris, where an art critic by the name of Michel Tàpies was a champion of art informal, and took Tàpies' work, Antoni Tàpies' work, under his wing in a certain sense, and became a champion of it. And I think this, with this exhibition in Paris, kind of was his breakout period. And through the promotion by Michel Tàpies, And there was a lot of success that followed in the heels of that exhibition, which I think eventually brought him into the collections and exhibitions of MoMA in New York and the Guggenheim, which external recognition internationally, Barcelona loved that. And in a way, we're able to armor him against the persecution by Franco on the Catalans, because he became a sort of recognized figure that had the establishment of Francoist Spain was ever so eager to repress. And in this show, we see a bit of the roll-down door, as they say, a bit of the wall, Tàpies. Tàpies' inspiration of everyday prosaic materials in the streets of Barcelona. And oftentimes with the promotional materials, there's just so much superlatives, it gets too sugary for me sometimes, but I've read elsewhere that the influence of the prosaic, the walls, the graffiti, the pockmarked bullet holes from the Civil War on the streets of Old Town Barcelona, that this roll-down door that you saw earlier, it's the squeaks of it operating, of metal rubbing against metal. The violin is suggesting that's music too, which in a way I roll my eyes in my head, but on the other hand, it's evocative, can't deny that. And here again, ephemera. And if you can see in these pictures, there's an effort throughout this exhibition to restage as closely as possible the circumstances, what people saw back then, and the viewers of this show are challenged to throw themselves back in this time, being 1956 of this show in Paris, Gallery Stadler. And now we're transported to Sala Gaspar in Barcelona in 1960. And it's this show where Tàpies really was cemented as I like to say, a mascot. And I don't mean that to diminish that position. I would love to be a mascot of any great city. But Barcelona, at the end of this exhibition, the government officially ponied up funds. I've read that it was 500,000 pesetas, 500,000 pesetas, which was alarming at the time and stirred up a lot of controversy. And that controversy, there's criticism, good or bad, is good for the artist. Your name is on the lips of people, and while people are debating whether it was a wise use of the city's fund, over the years, it proved out, because this city's identity is firmly established with the work of Antoni Tàpies. Oftentimes in governmental press conferences, speeches, you'll see a Tàpies painting in the background. So closely is his art identified with this city at a civic level. Art brut, Dubuffet, Sgraffito. And often when, as I'm doing my research, trying to soak up as much of this work I can find online, oftentimes it gets too sugary for me. The superlatives just pile one on top of the other. But the work is powerful. You can't deny that. And for its day, you have to remember, this is 1960 of this exhibition. It was breaking ground at that time. And I think it's got to be an influence on later artists like Twombly or even Schnabel. So that was the show. Have a great day. Expect more. And we'll talk to you later.